The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Mel's diner with the persistence of an old friend who wouldn't take no for an answer. Each droplet traced its own path down the glass, creating abstract patterns that caught the neon light from the flickering sign outside. The sign itself had seen better decades, its pink and blue letters spelling out Mel's in a font that screamed 1960s optimism, though the optimism had long since faded to a weathered resignation that matched the parking lot's cracked asphalt. Billy Joel pulled his rental car into a space near the back of the lot, the engine's purr dying away as he turned off the ignition. He sat for a moment in the silence, letting the weight of the day settle around him like dust. The recording session in Albany had been grueling. 3 takes of a song that just wouldn't come together the way he heard it in his head. The producer had been polite but frustrated, the session musicians professional but distant, everyone treating him with the careful deference reserved for living legends, which somehow made the creative process feel more like a museum exhibition than a musical collaboration. He adjusted his baseball cap in the rearview mirror, pulling the brim low over his eyes. The grey hoodie he wore was deliberately nondescript, purchased at a gas station somewhere between Albany and here for exactly this purpose. At 68, Billy Joel had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight, of becoming just another tired traveler seeking refuge from the storm. The brass bell above the diner's glass door announced his arrival, with a sound that belonged to a simpler era, when bells were bells and not electronic chimes programmed to sound welcoming. The interior of Mel's diner was a time capsule preserved in red vinyl and chrome, checkerboard linoleum and fluorescent lights that hummed their familiar tune of American endurance. The air was thick with the mingled aromas of coffee that had been brewing too long, bacon grease with a history, and the indefinable scent of thousands of conversations that had taken place over plates of comfort food. Behind the counter stood Margaret Sullivan, though everyone who had ever worked alongside her knew her simply as Maggie. At 57, she possessed the kind of beauty that advertising agencies couldn't manufacture. The beauty that comes from years of small kindnesses, of shoulders strong enough to carry other people's burdens, of eyes that had seen enough of life to understand its complexities without becoming cynical about its possibilities. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver threads that caught the harsh fluorescent light like spun moonbeams, was pulled back in a practical ponytail that had withstood 12 hours of constant motion. Her hands, graceful despite years of carrying heavy trays and washing endless dishes, moved with the efficiency of someone who had long ago learned to make every gesture count. The green uniform she wore was spotless despite the chaos of a busy evening, and her name tag, slightly crooked after countless adjustments throughout her shift, read Maggie in block letters that somehow managed to convey both authority and approachability. The diner held perhaps 15 patrons scattered across its expanse, like notes on a musical staff, each one occupying their own space in the evening's quiet symphony. At booth number 3, Harold Patterson, 73 years old and a widower of 6 months, nursed his 4th cup of black coffee while reading yesterday's newspaper for the 3rd time. He came here every Tuesday and Friday, not because the coffee was exceptional, but because the silence of his empty house had become too loud to bear. Near the window, 2 long-haul truckers debated the merits of different routes through Pennsylvania, their conversation punctuated by the occasional scrape of fork against plate as they worked their way through identical orders of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. They had driven these highways for decades, accumulating stories and opinions about every truck stop, diner, and roadside attraction between Maine and California. In the corner booth, a young mother named Sarah Chen struggled to keep her 3-year-old son entertained while she counted crumpled bills from her purse with the careful attention of someone for whom every dollar carried weight. She had been driving from Syracuse to New York City for a job interview, her first real prospect in 8 months, and had stopped here when her son began crying from hunger and fatigue. The interview was tomorrow morning, and she was calculating whether she could afford both dinner tonight and gas for the return trip. Billy chose booth number 7 in the back corner, sliding across vinyl that had been patched and repatched over the years, with tape that almost matched the original red. The booth gave him a clear view of the entire diner while keeping his back to the wall, a habit formed during decades of dining in public places where recognition could transform a quiet meal into an impromptu concert. He picked up the laminated menu, its plastic surface clouded with age and use, and scanned the offerings that had probably remained unchanged since the Carter administration. Comfort food with names like Trucker's Special and the Heartland Platter. Meals designed to fill stomachs and warm souls without breaking budgets or pretending to be anything other than what they were. The familiar scent of coffee and bacon grease wrapped around him like an embrace from his childhood, when diners like this had been his refuge from the chaos of a house where music competed with alcohol for his father's attention. In places like Mel's Diner, he had learned the rhythms of working-class America, the conversations and concerns that would later find their way into songs about piano men and scenes from an Italian restaurant. Maggie approached with a pot of coffee that had been her companion for the past hour, its contents strong enough to wake the dead and bitter enough to remind you that life wasn't always sweet. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had been doing this work for years, balancing efficiency with the kind of personal attention that made customers feel like human beings rather than order numbers. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of exhaustion mixed with genuine warmth. "Coffee to start you off?" Billy nodded, keeping his head down as she filled his cup with the practiced precision of a master craftsman. The ceramic clinked against the saucer in a rhythm that spoke of thousands of similar moments, each one a small ritual in the larger ceremony of American hospitality. "What's good tonight?" he asked, though they both understood the question was more about establishing human connection than seeking culinary advice. "Everything's fresh," Maggie replied, with the automatic response of a professional, though she immediately softened it with honesty. "Well, mostly fresh. The pot roast is actually pretty good today. Frank uses his mother's recipe, and she knew what she was doing. Comes with real mashed potatoes, not the instant stuff, and green beans that haven't been cooked to death." Billy found himself smiling at her candor. "I'll take the steak if you've got it, medium rare, with whatever sides you'd recommend to someone you actually cared about." The question caught Maggie off guard, and she looked up from her order pad to meet his eyes for the first time. There was something familiar about those eyes, brown and warm, with laugh lines that spoke of a life lived fully despite its complexities. But the recognition remained just out of reach, like a song title on the tip of her tongue. "Honestly?" she said, allowing herself a moment of genuine consultation. "Skip the fries. They're from a bag, and you deserve better. Get the roasted vegetables instead. Frank actually knows his way around a seasoning blend, and they'll make you feel like you're eating something your grandmother might have made if your grandmother had been a really good cook." "Sold," Billy said, appreciating both her honesty and her assumption that he had a grandmother worth remembering fondly. As Maggie wrote down the order, her pen, a cheap plastic ballpoint that had seen better days, caught on the paper and began to skip. She pressed harder, trying to coax the last bit of ink from its tired cartridge, but it was a losing battle. A flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks as she patted down her apron pockets, searching for the backup pen that she was almost certain she had forgotten to bring from the kitchen. "I'm sorry," she began, the frustration in her voice directed more at herself than at the situation. "Let me just run and grab." But Billy was already extending his own pen across the table, a beautiful instrument of silver and black with intricate engravings along its barrel that caught the harsh fluorescent light and transformed it into something approaching elegance. It was clearly expensive, the kind of writing instrument that suggested its owner valued the written word and understood that some tools were worth investing in. "Here," he said simply, and again their eyes met across the small table. This time, the moment lingered a beat longer than necessary, as if both of them sensed that this simple exchange carried more weight than its surface suggested. "Thank you," Maggie murmured, accepting the pen with the careful reverence of someone who recognized quality when she saw it. The weight of it in her hand was substantial, suggesting craftsmanship and attention to detail that belonged to a different era of manufacturing. "This is beautiful, really beautiful." Billy shrugged with practiced modesty. It was a gift from someone who thought words mattered. As Maggie finished writing his order, she found herself reluctant to return the pen. It felt good in her hand, balanced and purposeful in a way that made her remember when writing had been more than just taking down food orders and calculating tips. She had once filled notebooks with lyrics and poetry, had believed that words could change the world if you just arranged them in the right order. "Here," she said, starting to hand it back, but Billy waved her off with a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and decisive. "Keep it," he said. "I've got others, and something tells me you'll put it to better use than I will." "I couldn't possibly," she protested, but Billy's expression had already moved on, as if the matter was settled, and any further discussion would be an insult to both their intelligence. "Please," he said, and something in his tone, not commanding but quietly insistent, made her slip the pen into her apron pocket with a grateful nod that spoke volumes about the small kindnesses that could brighten an ordinary evening. As Maggie walked back toward the kitchen, Billy found himself studying her movements with the eye of someone who had spent decades observing human behavior and translating it into song. She moved between tables with the fluid grace of a dancer, but there was something else. A rhythm to her steps that suggested music lived somewhere inside her, even if it was buried beneath years of practical concerns and deferred dreams. She refilled Harold Patterson's coffee without being asked, remembering exactly how he liked it after months of Tuesday and Friday evening visits. She checked on the truckers, ensuring their water glasses remained full and their conversation uninterrupted. She paused at Sarah Chen's table to offer the little boy a crayon and a children's menu to color on, transforming his restlessness into focused creativity with the kind of maternal instinct that transcended biological relationships. But it was at table 6 that Billy witnessed something that made his jaw tighten with familiar anger. A businessman in an expensive suit, the kind of perfectly coordinated outfit that screamed success but whispered insecurity, snapped his fingers at Maggie as she passed with another customer's order balanced on her tray. "Hey, waitress!" he called, his voice cutting through the diner's gentle murmur like a knife through silk. "Where's my apple pie? I ordered it 20 minutes ago and I've got a conference call in an hour." Maggie paused mid-stride, the heavy tray requiring every muscle in her shoulders and back to maintain its balance. Her face, which had been animated with quiet contentment moments before, shifted into the carefully neutral expression of someone who had learned to absorb abuse without letting it poison her spirit. "I'll check on that right away, sir," she said, her voice maintaining its professional warmth despite the man's tone. "The kitchen's been a little backed up tonight since one of our cooks called in sick, but I'll make sure." "I don't want excuses," the businessman interrupted, his voice rising just enough to ensure that other customers would turn to look. "I want service. Maybe if you spent less time chatting with customers and more time doing your job, people wouldn't have to wait for basic items like pie." The diner fell into the kind of uncomfortable silence that occurs when public rudeness forces everyone to choose between intervention and pretending not to notice. Billy watched as Maggie's face flushed with humiliation, but also saw the way she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, a gesture of dignity that no amount of rudeness could diminish. "You're absolutely right, sir," she said with the kind of grace under fire that Billy recognized from his own encounters with critics and hecklers. "I'll get your pie right now and make sure it's exactly what you ordered." She continued to the kitchen without another word, leaving the businessman to return to his smartphone and his sense of superiority, while the rest of the diner's patrons slowly resumed their conversations with the awkward energy of witnesses to an unnecessary cruelty. Billy found himself thinking about all the times he had witnessed similar scenes throughout his life, in recording studios where session musicians were treated like furniture, in hotels where housekeeping staff were invisible unless something was wrong, in restaurants where servers were expected to absorb every customer's bad day with a smile. It reminded him of his own early years, playing piano in cocktail lounges where drunk patrons talked through his music and treated him like expensive background noise. The incident gnawed at him as he waited for his meal, stirring memories of every job he'd worked before music became his living, delivering papers, pumping gas, cleaning offices. He remembered the sting of being dismissed, overlooked, treated as less than fully human, because his work was considered service rather than professional. He had sworn to himself that success would never make him forget what it felt like to be on the receiving end of casual disrespect. When Maggie returned with his steak, Billy looked up and offered her the kind of smile that sees past uniforms and name tags to the person underneath. "Thank you, Maggie," he said, putting genuine warmth into her name. She paused, genuinely surprised. In a world where most customers barely made eye contact, having someone use her actual name felt like a small miracle. "How did you—" Billy gestured toward her name tag, though the truth was more complicated. During a brief trip to the men's room, he had asked Frank about the auburn-haired waitress who moved like she had music in her soul. Frank had spoken about Maggie with the fond exasperation of someone who had watched her handle every crisis and difficult customer with unflappable grace for the better part of a decade. "Lucky guess," Billy said with a smile that invited her to share the small deception. As Maggie set down his plate, the steak cooked exactly as he'd requested, accompanied by roasted vegetables that actually looked like someone had cared about their preparation, she found herself noticing his hands. They were pianist's hands, no question about it. Long fingers with calluses in very specific places, the kind that came from years of contact with piano keys rather than guitar strings. The nails were trimmed short on his right hand, but slightly longer on his left, a detail that spoke of classical training adapted to popular music sensibilities. "Are you a musician?" she asked without thinking, then immediately looked embarrassed by her own curiosity. "I'm sorry, that's really none of my business. Well, you have pianist's hands." Billy paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, considering how to answer. This was always the delicate moment, the choice between maintaining anonymity and acknowledging the connection that music created between strangers. "I play a little piano," he said carefully. "Nothing too fancy. How about you? Do you play anything?" Maggie's laugh was soft and self-deprecating, but Billy caught the note of genuine grief that ran underneath it like a minor chord in a major key song. "Me? Oh no. Well, I used to. A long time ago." She shook her head as if dismissing a foolish thought. "But that was another lifetime. Can I get you anything else with your meal?" "What did you play?" Billy asked, ignoring her attempt to redirect the conversation back to customer service. The question stopped her completely, as if no one had asked about her musical past in so many years that she'd forgotten it was possible for someone to be curious. For a moment, vulnerability flickered across her features, like sunlight through clouds, revealing depths that her professional demeanor usually kept hidden. "Piano, mostly," she said, her voice growing distant with memory. "Some guitar. I wrote songs, actually." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. But like I said, that was another lifetime. Billy set down his fork, giving her his complete attention in a way that suggested her answer mattered more than his dinner. "What kind of songs?" "The kind nobody wants to hear," Maggie replied with a laugh that didn't quite manage to hide the old pain. "At least that's what I was told often enough." Before Billy could respond, the businessman at table 6 was snapping his fingers again, this time with the impatience of someone who believed the world existed solely for his convenience. "Waitress, this coffee's gone cold and I still haven't seen my pie." Maggie's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, the weight of the evening's accumulated small humiliations pressing down on her like gravity. "I should..." she began, but Billy's quiet voice stopped her. "He can wait," Billy said, his tone gentle but carrying an authority that came from years of commanding attention in rooms full of people. "Tell me about your songs." For a moment that stretched between them like a bridge across time. Maggie looked as if she might actually sit down in the booth across from him. Her eyes held the expression of someone who hadn't been asked about her dreams in so long that she'd almost forgotten how to articulate them. But then the kitchen bell rang with the insistence of a fire alarm, signaling that another order was ready and the spell was broken. "I really should get back to work," she said, though her voice carried a note of genuine regret. "But thank you for asking. It's been a long time since anyone wanted to know about that part of my life." Billy watched her walk away, something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, the recognition of a kindred spirit trapped in circumstances that had nothing to do with their true nature. He had met thousands of musicians over the decades, but there was something about Maggie that reminded him of himself in those early years, when music was still a dream rather than a career, when every song felt like it contained the secrets of the universe if you could just find the right way to unlock them. The evening progressed with the predictable rhythms of diner life, but Billy found himself paying less attention to his meal and more attention to the small dramas playing out around him. He watched as Maggie served the businessman his pie with unflappable professionalism, even though he complained that it was too warm and demanded she bring him a fresh cup of coffee to go with it. He observed her patience with Harold Patterson, who had clearly had too much caffeine but was afraid to go home to his empty house. He noticed how she slipped the little boy at the corner table an extra packet of crackers when his mother wasn't looking, and how she managed to make every customer feel like they were the most important person in her world during their brief interaction. Billy pulled out a small notebook, a habit from his songwriting days that he'd never managed to shake, and began sketching out observations and phrases. The words came slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as he found the rhythm of Maggie's story. She pours the coffee with a gentle hand, dreams that nobody understands. Behind her eyes, a song waits to be heard, but the world's forgotten how to listen to her words. She moves like music through the evening light, serving hope to strangers in the night, and nobody knows the symphony inside. The waitress who learned to let her music hide. As he wrote, Billy became aware of something he hadn't noticed before. Maggie was humming, not loudly and probably not consciously, but there was definitely a melody threading through her movements as she cleaned tables and refilled salt shakers. It was a beautiful melody, something he'd never heard before, with a haunting quality that suggested it had been born from experience rather than ambition. He found himself trying to capture the melody in his notebook, sketching out musical phrases between the lyrics that were forming in his mind. This was how his best songs had always begun, not with grand intentions or commercial considerations, but with moments of human truth that demanded to be translated into music. Around 10:30, the dinner crowd began to thin out. The truckers finished their meal and departed with friendly nods to Maggie, leaving tips that were generous by their standards, if not lavish by any other measure. The businessman left without leaving anything extra, making sure to comment loudly to his phone companion about the subpar service as he walked past Maggie on his way out. Harold Patterson folded his newspaper and shuffled toward the door, stopping to pat Maggie's shoulder and whisper something that made her smile genuinely for the first time all evening. Sarah Chen and her son were among the last to leave, and Billy watched as Maggie knelt down to the boy's level to show him the picture he had colored on his children's menu. She praised his artistic choices with the kind of enthusiasm that wasn't performed, but authentic. And when Sarah tried to apologize for how long they had occupied the table, Maggie waved off the concern and pressed a paper bag into the young mother's hands. "Just some cookies for the road," she said quietly. "And for the record, anyone who interviews you tomorrow would be lucky to have you. You're raising a wonderful little boy, which tells me everything I need to know about what kind of person you are." Billy felt something tighten in his throat as he watched this exchange. He had seen kindness in many forms throughout his life, but there was something particularly moving about generosity offered by someone who clearly had little to spare. Maggie's gift wasn't just cookies. It was recognition, encouragement, and the kind of human connection that could carry someone through a difficult tomorrow. As the clock approached 11, Maggie began her closing duties with the methodical precision of someone who had performed these same tasks thousands of times. She wiped down tables with careful attention to detail, refilled salt and pepper shakers, and counted the contents of the till with the focused concentration of someone for whom every dollar needed to be accounted for. Billy remained in his corner booth, occasionally ordering another cup of coffee to justify his continued presence. He was in no hurry to return to the highway, and something about the diner's atmosphere was feeding his creative spirit in a way that luxury hotels and high-end restaurants never could. This was real life, unfiltered and authentic, and he had always drawn his best material from places where people were simply themselves, without pretense or performance. When Maggie finally approached his table with the coffee pot and her order pad, the diner had settled into the peaceful quiet of late evening. Only a handful of customers remained, and most of them were lost in their own thoughts or quiet conversations. "Long day?" Billy asked, looking up from his notebook. Maggie managed a tired smile that somehow still contained warmth. "Aren't they all? But it's honest work, and I'm grateful for it." She paused, noticing his notebook for the first time. "Are you writing something?" "Just some observations," Billy said, closing the notebook carefully. "I was wondering, though, would you have a few minutes to talk? About music, I mean. I know you're busy, but..." Maggie glanced around the nearly empty diner. Frank was in the back office doing paperwork. The cook had gone home an hour ago, and the remaining customers seemed content with their coffee and their solitude. "I suppose I could spare a few minutes," she said, sliding into the booth across from him with a sigh that spoke of feet that had carried her through a very long day. "But honestly, there's not much to say. I haven't played in, it must be 15 years now." "What happened?" Billy asked, and the simplicity of the question seemed to open a door that Maggie hadn't walked through in a very long time. She stared down at her hands, wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that she had poured for herself from the pot she kept behind the counter. The steam rose between them like incense, carrying with it memories that she had carefully buried beneath layers of practical concerns and daily survival. "Life happened," she said finally, and Billy heard in those two words the same story he had encountered countless times throughout his career. The story of talent interrupted by circumstance, dreams deferred by necessity, music silenced by the demands of simply getting by. "I came to New York in 1983, she continued, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone revisiting a foreign country. "Right out of college, with a guitar, a notebook full of songs, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been truly rejected. I thought I was going to change the world, or at least change the music business." Billy leaned forward, recognizing the universal story of every young artist who had ever believed that talent and determination were enough to guarantee success. He had lived that story himself, though his version had ended differently than most. "I played everywhere they'd let me," Maggie continued. "Coffee houses in the village, open mic nights in dive bars, any venue that would give an unknown songwriter 5 minutes to prove herself. I waitressed during the day to pay for demo recordings, and I spent every free evening playing for crowds that were usually more interested in their conversations than my music." "Did you ever get close?" Billy asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "A few times," Maggie nodded, a ghost of old excitement flickering across her features. "There was this A&R guy from Columbia Records, Danny something or other, who heard me at a club in the village and said I had something special. He wanted me to come in for a meeting, maybe cut some demos with real studio musicians." She paused, taking a sip of her tea as if the warmth could somehow soften the memory of what came next. "But when I showed up for the meeting, it wasn't just Danny. His boss was there too, some vice president whose name I can't even remember now. They listened to 3 songs, and then the VP said I was too old at 28. Can you imagine? 28 and already over the hill. Billy felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. He had heard this story too many times, had seen too many talented artists dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with their music. The industry's obsession with youth, particularly when it came to female artists, had cost the world countless songs that deserved to be heard. "That's insane," he said, and meant it completely. "That's the music business," Maggie replied with the resignation of someone who had long ago made peace with disappointment. After that, it was one rejection after another. Not commercial enough. Too folk for pop, too pop for folk. Great voice, but the songs don't have hooks. I heard every possible variation of no that the English language could provide. "So you gave up?" "I got realistic," Maggie corrected, though Billy could hear the defensive note in her voice that suggested this was an argument she'd had with herself many times over the years. "My father got sick. Lung cancer from 40 years of smoking 2 packs a day. My mother had died when I was 16, so it was just me to take care of him." She stared out the window at the rain, which had intensified during their conversation, drumming against the glass with increasing urgency. "I moved back here to Rhinebeck to be closer to him. Got a job at the regional hospital so I could adjust my shifts around his treatments. Music became, well, it became something I used to do, like playing field hockey in high school or speaking French. Just part of a past that didn't have any connection to my present." Billy felt the familiar ache in his chest that came from recognizing his own story in someone else's pain. His own father's struggles with alcohol had shaped his early years in ways that still echoed through his music decades later. The difference was that his family's dysfunction had somehow fueled his creativity rather than derailing it. But he knew that was more luck than anything else. "How long were you his caregiver?" Billy asked gently. 3 years, Maggie said. 3 years of hospitals and treatments, and watching someone you love disappear piece by piece. He fought hard, harder than anyone should have to fight. But cancer doesn't care how much fight you have in you. She was quiet for a moment, lost in memories that were clearly still painful even years later. "When he died, I discovered that he'd taken out a second mortgage on the house to pay for experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. Treatments that might have given him a few more months, but definitely would have bankrupted us both if I'd known about them." "Jesus," Billy murmured. "I kept the house by working 3 jobs," Maggie continued. "Days at the hospital, evenings here at the diner, weekends cleaning offices. Music became, well, it became a luxury I couldn't afford. And eventually, you stop missing what you don't have time to think about." Billy found himself thinking about all the musicians he knew who had been able to pursue their art because they had family support, financial cushions, or simply the luck to avoid major personal crises during their formative years. Talent was only part of the equation. Timing, circumstances, and sheer luck played roles that were rarely acknowledged in success stories. "But you still have it," Billy said quietly. "The music, I mean. I can tell." Maggie looked up from her tea, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "How can you possibly tell that?" "The way you move," Billy explained. "There's a rhythm to everything you do, like you're hearing music that the rest of us can't quite catch. And you were humming earlier while you were cleaning tables, something beautiful that I'd never heard before." A flush of embarrassment colored Maggie's cheeks. "I didn't realize I was doing that. It's just, sometimes melodies come into my head, and I guess I don't always keep them to myself as well as I should." "Was it something you wrote?" "Years ago," she admitted. "It was going to be part of a song about small towns and the dreams that people carry with them even when they've stopped believing in them. But I never finished it, never wrote the lyrics that went with the melody." For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence. 2 people who understood the particular pain of unfinished songs and abandoned dreams. Outside, the rain continued its percussion against the windows, while inside, the fluorescent lights hummed their electronic lullaby over the nearly empty diner. "What about you?" Maggie asked finally, turning the conversation away from her own history. "You said you played piano. Are you professional?" This was the moment Billy had been both anticipating and dreading. The point where his anonymity would give way to recognition, where their conversation might shift from genuine human connection to the careful dance of celebrity interaction. But something about Maggie's openness, her vulnerability in sharing her own story, made him want to reciprocate with equal honesty. "I've been fortunate," he said carefully. "I've managed to make a living at it." "Local gigs, mostly?" she asked, and Billy could hear in her voice the assumption that he was probably a wedding pianist or lounge player, someone who had found a way to make music pay the bills without achieving anything resembling fame. "Some traveling," Billy admitted. "I play larger venues sometimes, concert halls, that kind of thing." Something in his tone made Maggie study his face more carefully. The baseball cap cast shadows across his features, but now that she was really looking, there was something familiar about the shape of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the particular timbre of his speaking voice. Her eyes widened as recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise over a landscape that had been hidden in darkness. Her hand went instinctively to her mouth, and Billy could see the exact moment when his carefully maintained anonymity crumbled away. "Oh my God," she whispered. You're Billy Joel." Billy nodded, prepared for the usual transformation, the sudden shift from natural conversation to starstruck awkwardness, the requests for selfies and autographs, the way genuine human connection often evaporated in the face of celebrity recognition. Instead, Maggie leaned back in the booth, her expression cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and something that might have been wonder. "I can't believe I didn't recognize you immediately," she said. "I mean, I grew up with your music. Piano Man, Just the Way You Are, New York State of Mind. God, I must have played along to the Stranger album 1,000 times when I was learning piano arrangements." "You played my songs?" Billy asked, genuinely touched by the revelation. "All of them," Maggie confirmed, her voice taking on the enthusiasm of someone remembering a passion they had almost forgotten. You are one of the main reasons I wanted to be a songwriter in the first place. The way you told stories in your songs, painted entire scenes with just a few verses and a chorus. I used to study your lyrics like they were poetry, trying to understand how you made ordinary moments feel so universal and important." Billy felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the diner's coffee or its overheated atmosphere. After decades of professional acclaim and critical recognition, it was still the personal connections, the individual stories of how his music had touched someone's life, that meant the most to him. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means more than you know. Really." "I should be thanking you," Maggie replied. "Your music got me through some of the darkest periods of my life. When my dad was sick, and I felt like I was drowning in medical bills and impossible decisions, I'd put on The River of Dreams or Honesty and somehow find the strength to keep going for another day." They talked for another hour as the diner settled into the deep quiet of midnight. Maggie shared more stories of her musical aspirations, the songs she had written, the performances that had given her hope, the gradual process of accepting that some dreams simply weren't meant to be realized. Billy found himself opening up about his own struggles with fame, the weight of expectations, and the constant challenge of staying creatively honest in an industry that often valued commercial success over artistic integrity. "The ironic thing about success," Billy said, refilling Maggie's tea from the pot she had brought over, "is that it can be just as isolating as failure, just in different ways. When you're struggling, you feel alone because nobody understands your dreams. When you're successful, you feel alone because nobody treats you like a regular person anymore." "Is that why you're here?" Maggie asked. "Traveling incognito, I mean." "Partly," Billy admitted. I was driving back from a recording session in Albany, and I saw this place. It looked authentic, real, like somewhere I could just be Billy the person instead of Billy Joel the performer. I wanted to sit somewhere and eat a meal without having to sign napkins or pose for pictures or pretend to be on when all I really wanted was to be invisible for a while. "Are you disappointed that I recognized you?" Maggie asked, and Billy could hear in her voice a genuine concern that she had somehow ruined his evening by piercing through his carefully constructed anonymity. Billy considered the question carefully, looking around the diner that had become a sanctuary for both of them in different ways. "No," he said finally, "because you're not treating me like Billy Joel the celebrity. You're talking to me like Billy, the person who happens to play piano for a living. There's a huge difference, and most people never figure that out." Maggie understood exactly what he meant. In her years of service work, she had learned to see past people's exteriors, their clothes, their jobs, their bank accounts, to the essential humanity that connected everyone. Rich or poor, famous or unknown, everyone needed the same fundamental things: respect, kindness, understanding, and the sense that their story mattered to someone else in the world. "I've always believed that everybody has a story worth hearing," she said. "Yours just happens to be one that more people know about than most." As the clock on the wall approached midnight, Frank emerged from the back office, keys jingling in his weathered hands like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. He was a man in his early 70s who had owned Mel's Diner for nearly 4 decades, watching the highway change around him while his little establishment remained a constant in an increasingly uncertain world. His hair had gone completely silver, and his face bore the lines of someone who had seen enough of life to understand both its cruelties and its unexpected graces. His bark was considerably worse than his bite, but he ran his establishment with the kind of old-school attention to detail that was becoming increasingly rare in American business. Every employee knew that Frank cared more about treating customers with dignity than maximizing profit margins, which was why people like Maggie had worked for him for years, despite being able to make more money at chain restaurants. "Maggie, you ready to lock up?" he called, then noticed Billy for the first time. His experienced eye took in the baseball cap, the expensive pen on the table, the way the stranger seemed comfortable in his own skin despite clearly trying to avoid attention. "Sir, I hate to interrupt, but we're closing up for the night." "Of course," Billy said, reaching for his wallet. "I'm sorry to keep you both so late." "Don't you dare apologize," Maggie said quickly. This has been the best conversation I've had in years." She paused, looking embarrassed by her own admission. "What do I owe you for the meal?" Billy started to protest, but Maggie held up her hand with the kind of gentle authority that brooked no argument. "Please, let me do this. It's the least I can do for someone whose music has given me so much over the years." Billy could see that this gesture was important to her in ways that went beyond simple hospitality. Sometimes the most meaningful gifts were those given by people who had very little to spare, because they came from the heart rather than from excess. He nodded his acceptance, understanding that refusing would somehow diminish the value of her offering. "Thank you," he said simply. "That's very kind." As Billy prepared to leave, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts with the deliberate care of someone making an important decision. "Maggie, I want to give you something. Not because you recognized me or because you're a fan, but because you're a songwriter who never got the chance she deserved." He wrote something on a napkin in his distinctive handwriting, a name and phone number, along with a few words that Maggie couldn't quite read in the diner's fluorescent lighting. "This is my friend Danny Korchmar. He's a producer who's worked with James Taylor, Carole King, Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, real musicians who care about songs more than demographics." Maggie stared at the napkin as if it might burst into flames. I couldn't possibly. I haven't written anything new in 15 years. I probably don't even remember how to hold a guitar properly anymore." "Music doesn't leave you," Billy said gently. "It just goes dormant, like seeds waiting for the right season to grow. Danny's always looking for authentic voices, real stories from people who have actually lived the songs they write. He's not interested in manufactured pop or focus group tested hooks. He wants truth. But what would I tell him? That Billy Joel gave me his number. He'll think I'm some kind of delusional fan. Billy smiled and pulled out his phone again. Danny, it's Billy. I know it's late, but I wanted to tell you about someone I just met. He walked a few steps away from the table, speaking quietly into the phone for several minutes, while Maggie sat frozen in disbelief, the napkin trembling in her hands like a leaf in a strong wind. She could hear fragments of Billy's conversation, words like authentic, real songwriter, deserves a chance. But the full content remained private. When he returned, Maggie was still staring at the napkin as if it contained the secrets of the universe. He's expecting your call, Billy said. Next week, whenever you're ready. He has a small studio in Woodstock, about an hour from here. He wants to hear your songs. Tears had begun to form in Maggie's eyes, though she seemed unaware of them. I don't know what to say. Say you'll give it a chance, Billy replied. Say you'll dust off that guitar and remember why you fell in love with music in the first place. Say you'll stop letting other people's opinions define what you're capable of achieving. Frank cleared his throat gently, reminding them that the evening needed to come to an end despite the emotional weight of the moment. Billy pulled on his jacket and headed toward the door, then paused and turned back to face Maggie one final time. That businessman who was rude to you earlier? He said. He was wrong about everything. You provide extraordinary service, but more than that, you make people feel welcome in a world that can be pretty cold and indifferent. That's a gift, Maggie, just like your music. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. After Billy left, disappearing into the rainy night like a figure from a dream, Maggie sat alone in the empty diner with the napkin clutched in her hands and 1,000 thoughts racing through her mind. Frank finished his closing duties with uncharacteristic gentleness, sensing that something significant had just occurred, even if he didn't understand the details. You okay, kid? He asked, as he turned off the main lights, leaving only the security illumination that would keep the diner safely lit until morning. I think so, Maggie said, though her voice suggested she wasn't entirely sure what okay meant anymore. Frank, do you think it's possible for people to get second chances at dreams they gave up on? Frank paused in his counting of the evening's receipts, looking at Maggie with the kind of paternal concern that had developed over their years of working together. I think, he said carefully, that life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. And I think that anyone who's watched you handle every crisis and difficult customer that's walked through that door knows you're capable of just about anything you set your mind to. Alone in the diner after Frank locked up and drove away, Maggie walked over to the old upright piano that sat in the corner like a piece of forgotten furniture. It had been there since the diner's earlier incarnation as a supper club in the 1950s, and while it was slightly out of tune and showed the wear of decades of neglect, it was still functional. She sat down on the worn bench and pressed middle C, the note ringing clear despite the instrument's age. Her fingers found the opening chords of Piano Man almost automatically, muscle memory from countless hours of playing along to Billy Joel albums in her bedroom during her teenage years. But as she played, something shifted, and the familiar chords began to morph into something entirely new. Words began to form in her mind, not Billy's lyrics, but her own. Late shift at the diner, rain against the glass, serving coffee dreams to strangers as they pass. Behind the counter, behind the smile. There's a song that's been waiting all the while, but tonight an angel came disguised with kind eyes and a heart that recognized the music sleeping in these weary hands, and suddenly I remember who I am. She played until her fingers remembered their old strength, until melodies she had buried under years of practical concerns began to surface like flowers after a long, hard winter. The napkin with Danny Korchmar's information sat propped against the piano's music stand, a tangible reminder that dreams deferred weren't necessarily dreams destroyed. For the first time in 15 years, Maggie Sullivan allowed herself to imagine a future that included music as more than just a memory. The possibility felt both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you might actually have wings. 4 days later, after rehearsing the conversation in her mind dozens of times, Maggie called the number on the napkin. Her hands shook as she dialed, but her voice was steady when Danny Korchmar answered on the second ring. "Danny, this is Maggie Sullivan. Billy Joel said that you'd be willing to listen to some songs." They talked for over an hour about music, about life, about the songs that had been waiting inside her for a decade and a half. Danny's voice was warm and encouraging, with the kind of professional enthusiasm that came from someone who genuinely loved discovering new talent rather than simply manufacturing commercial products. "Billy told me you write from real experience," Danny said. "That's becoming rare in this business. Everyone wants to write hits instead of writing truth. But the best songs, the ones that last, they come from people who have actually lived the stories they're telling." A week after that phone call, Maggie made the drive to Woodstock with her father's old guitar case in the back seat and a spiral notebook full of lyrics that she had written during every spare moment since Billy's visit. The recording studio was smaller and more intimate than she had expected, with the kind of lived-in comfort that suggested real music happened there regularly. The session lasted 6 hours and resulted in rough demos of 4 original songs, stories about small-town life, dreams interrupted by necessity, the dignity of honest work, and the unexpected kindness of strangers. Danny listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the difference between technical proficiency and emotional authenticity. "These are good," he said when they finished recording. "There's something here that most writers really spend their whole careers trying to find: genuine emotional truth. The melodies are strong, the lyrics paint pictures, and your voice has lived these songs." 2 months later, Maggie received a call that changed the trajectory of her life once again. A small, independent record label that specialized in folk and Americana had heard her demos through Danny's connections. They weren't offering a fortune or promising stadium tours, but they wanted to discuss a recording contract for a full album. "It's not going to make you rich," the label representative explained during their first meeting. "But we believe in music that matters, songs that connect with people on a real level. Your demos reminded us why we got into this business in the first place." Billy Joel learned about Maggie's recording deal through Danny, but he didn't contact her directly. He had learned over the years that the most meaningful gifts were those given without expectation of recognition or gratitude. Instead, he filed her story away with all the other moments that reminded him why music mattered, not for the awards or the chart positions, but for its power to create connections between human hearts across all the distances that normally separated them. 6 months after that rainy night at Mel's Diner, Maggie's debut album was released with the title The Waitress and the Card. The cover featured a simple photograph of a diner table with 2 coffee cups and a silver pen lying beside a handwritten napkin, an image that told the entire story without need for explanation. The album consisted of 10 songs that painted intimate portraits of working-class American life with the kind of unflinching honesty that could only come from someone who had actually lived these experiences. There were songs about single mothers counting change for grocery money, about elderly men drinking coffee in diners because silence at home had become too loud to bear, about dreams that survive despite being buried under layers of practical necessity. The album didn't chart on Billboard or receive heavy radio rotation, but it found its audience among people who understood its truths. Public radio stations that specialized in folk and roots music began playing the title track. Music blogs and independent publications praised Maggie's authentic voice and lived-in storytelling. Most importantly, her songs began reaching people who needed to hear them, other dreamers who thought their moment had passed, other workers whose contributions went unrecognized, other hearts that had learned to beat a little quieter in order to survive. Billy attended one of Maggie's early performances at a small acoustic venue in Saratoga Springs, about an hour from the diner where they had first met. He sat in the back of the room, wearing the same baseball cap and gray hoodie that had allowed him to remain anonymous that rainy evening months before. The venue was intimate, maybe 60 seats arranged around a small stage that was barely elevated above the audience. The crowd was a mix of ages, from college students discovering folk music to older listeners who remembered when songs were expected to tell complete stories rather than simply provide background for lifestyle marketing. When Maggie took the stage with just her guitar and a microphone, she looked nervous but determined. She had traded her diner uniform for simple jeans and a sweater, but she carried herself with the same quiet dignity that Billy had first noticed during her interactions with difficult customers. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying easily through the small room. "My name is Maggie Sullivan, and these are songs about the people I've met and the places I've worked and the dreams that sometimes take longer to come true than we think they should." She opened with a song called Third Shift Blues, about the invisible army of workers who kept the world running while everyone else slept. Her voice had developed a richer texture since those demo recordings, gaining confidence and emotional range that came from performing for live audiences who were actually listening. The crowd was attentive in the way that only happens when people recognize authentic artistry. There was no talking during songs, no checking of phones, no sense that the music was competing with anything else for attention. This was the kind of performance that reminded everyone present why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. Halfway through her set, Maggie introduced a song that made Billy straighten in his seat. "This next one is called The Stranger in the Diner," she said. "It's about a night when someone I'd never met before reminded me that it's never too late to remember who you used to dream of becoming." The song told the story of their encounter without mentioning names or specific details that would compromise Billy's privacy. Instead, it focused on the universal theme of unexpected kindness, on the power of one person seeing value in another when they had forgotten how to see it in themselves. The melody was built around that haunting tune she had been humming that first night, now fully developed into something that felt both intimate and anthemic. He sat in the corner booth with secrets in his eyes, asked me about my music like my dreams might still be worth the try. And when he left that silver pen, he left me something more, a reminder that some gifts can open any door. Now I'm standing on this stage with my guitar in hand, singing songs I thought were buried like castles in the sand, all because a stranger saw the music I thought I'd lost and proved that kindness is a bridge worth any cost. After the show, as the crowd gradually dispersed and Maggie packed up her guitar, Billy approached the small merchandise table where she was signing CDs and chatting with fans. When she saw him, her face lit up with the kind of genuine joy that had nothing to do with celebrity recognition and everything to do with the pleasure of seeing an old friend. "You came," she said, and Billy could hear in her voice both surprise and deep gratitude. "I wouldn't have missed it," Billy replied. "You were incredible up there, Maggie. Those songs, they're the real thing, honest and true and necessary." They embraced briefly, two musicians who understood that the greatest success wasn't measured in sales figures or award nominations, but in moments of genuine connection between performer and audience, between one human heart and another. "I never properly thanked you," Maggie said as they stood together in the emptying venue. "For that night, for the introduction to Danny, for believing in me when I had completely stopped believing in myself." "You don't need to thank me," Billy said. "You did all the real work. You wrote the songs. You found the courage to perform them. You built something meaningful out of your own experience. I just provided a phone number. You provided hope, Maggie corrected, and hope changes everything. As the venue emptied around them, they talked about music and dreams, about the paths that bring us to where we need to be, even when we can't see the destination. Billy bought a copy of Maggie's CD and asked her to sign it, which made her laugh with the kind of delighted disbelief that comes from finding yourself in a situation you never could have imagined. "What should I write?" she asked, pen poised above the liner notes. "Whatever feels right," Billy said. After a moment's thought, she wrote, "To Billy, who taught me that the most beautiful music isn't always found in concert halls, but in small acts of kindness between strangers. Thank you for seeing the song in me when I couldn't see it myself. With endless gratitude, Maggie." Years passed, and Maggie's music career developed along its own unique trajectory. She never became famous in the traditional sense. No Grammy nominations, no sold-out arenas, no appearances on late-night television. But her songs found their way into the hearts and lives of people who needed them, which was all she had ever really wanted. She recorded 3 more albums over the next decade, each one documenting different chapters of her journey from forgotten dreamer to working musician. The songs grew more sophisticated as her confidence increased, but they never lost the fundamental honesty that had made her debut so compelling. She continued working at Mel's Diner 3 days a week, partly because she needed the steady income that music alone couldn't provide, but also because the diner remained her connection to the real-world experiences that fed her songwriting. The regular customers became accustomed to seeing their waitress occasionally disappear for weekend gigs or short tours, and many of them took pride in knowing someone who had made it in the music business, even if their definition of success differed from the industry's standard metrics. The silver pen that Billy had given her that first night became her most treasured possession. She used it to write every song on every album, its surface worn smooth by her fingers over years of constant use. It sat on her desk at home like a talisman, reminding her daily that inspiration could come from the most unexpected sources, and that the smallest gestures could create the largest changes in someone's life. Sometimes, during late shifts at the diner when the evening crowd had thinned and only the regulars remained, Maggie would find herself thinking about that rainy night and the chain of events it had set in motion. She had learned that life rarely unfolded according to our plans, but that didn't mean our dreams were meaningless. Sometimes they just needed to hibernate for a while, waiting for the right season and the right catalyst to bloom again. The business card that had started everything, now yellowed with age and carefully preserved in a frame, hung in her home studio next to photographs from recording sessions and concert performances. Beside it was a picture that Danny Korchmar had taken during her first day in his Woodstock studio, showing her hands on the piano keys with an expression of pure joy on her face as she rediscovered the musician she had always been underneath the uniform and the practical concerns. In the photograph, she was wearing the silver pen on a chain around her neck, having turned it into a necklace that she wore during every recording session and performance. It had become her symbol of transformation, her reminder that dreams deferred were not dreams denied, and her tribute to the power of human kindness to change the course of someone's entire life. Billy Joel, meanwhile, continued his own musical journey with a renewed appreciation for the impact that individual acts of generosity could have on other people's lives. He never spoke publicly about his encounter with Maggie, understanding that some stories were too personal and sacred to be reduced to entertainment value for interviews or talk show appearances. But sometimes, when he was alone at his piano in the early hours of the morning working on new material, he would play a few bars of one of Maggie's songs and remember the lesson he had learned that rainy night, that fame was temporary, success was subjective, but the power to lift another person's spirit and help them remember their own worth was perhaps the most important gift anyone could offer. He began carrying extra pens in his jacket pocket, not because he expected to encounter other struggling artists in diners, but because he had learned that opportunities to make a difference in someone's life often presented themselves in the most ordinary moments. The key was being present enough to recognize them and generous enough to act. Maggie's story became more than just her own when her music began reaching other waitresses working double shifts, other single parents counting change for groceries, other dreamers who thought their moment had passed. Her songs carried messages of hope to factory workers in Detroit, to teachers in rural schools, to elderly people sitting alone in diners across America because the silence at home had become too overwhelming to bear. Each listener found their own meaning in her melodies, their own story reflected in her carefully crafted lyrics. The songs became mirrors in which people could see their own struggles acknowledged and their own dreams validated, even if those dreams had been buried under years of practical necessity and social expectations. And Billy Joel, driving home from concerts in venues that held thousands of people, would sometimes tune his car radio to small stations that played independent artists. When one of Maggie's songs came through the speakers during those long drives through the American landscape, he would smile and remember that the most important music wasn't necessarily the music that sold the most copies or generated the most revenue. The most important music was the music that reminded people they weren't alone in their struggles, that their stories mattered, that their dreams, no matter how long deferred, still had the power to transform not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone who heard their songs. The pen continued to move across paper in Maggie's careful handwriting, creating new songs about the endless complexity and surprising beauty of ordinary American life. And somewhere in those lyrics, in the spaces between the words and the silence between the notes, lived the echo of a chance encounter that had proved dreams were never truly lost, only waiting for the right moment and the right act of kindness to bloom again. This was the real power of music, Billy had learned. Not to achieve commercial success or critical acclaim, though those things had their place, but to create connections between human hearts across all the distances that normally separated them. Music had the power to remind people that everyone had a story worth telling, a song worth singing, a dream worth pursuing, no matter how long it had waited in the shadows of more practical concerns. In truck stops and diners, in small clubs and house concerts, in the quiet moments when someone put on a CD and heard their own experience reflected in a stranger's song, Maggie's music continued to create those connections. Her voice carried the message that everyone, absolutely everyone, had something precious to contribute to the vast symphony of human experience. The rain that had brought Billy to Mel's diner that autumn evening had seemed like nothing more than weather at the time. But like so many of life's most significant moments, its true meaning had revealed itself slowly, in the way that small acts of kindness rippled outward through time, creating waves of positive change that extended far beyond their original point of impact. Maggie's transformation from forgotten dreamer to working musician had inspired other people to dust off their own abandoned dreams. Her story became a reminder that it was never too late to remember who you had once hoped to become. Never too late to pick up the pen or the guitar or the paintbrush and create something that mattered. And in living rooms and coffee shops, in recording studios and concert venues, in the millions of small moments when people chose to encourage rather than discourage, to lift up rather than tear down, to see the potential in others even when they couldn't see it in themselves, the circle of kindness continued to expand. The diner still stood on Route 9, its neon sign still flickering in the evening light, still offering refuge to travelers and locals alike. Frank had retired and sold the business to a young couple who understood that some institutions were worth preserving, not because they were profitable, but because they served as gathering places for the human community. Maggie still worked there occasionally, now as much by choice as by necessity. The new owners had hung one of her album covers on the wall near the piano, along with a small plaque that read, "Maggie Sullivan, our own Grammy winner." Even though she had never actually won a Grammy, the sentiment was what mattered. Regular customers would sometimes ask her to play a song or two on the old upright piano, and she would oblige with the grace of someone who understood that music was meant to be shared rather than hoarded. Sometimes, late-shift customers would ask if she knew any Billy Joel songs, and she would always smile and say she knew a few. What she didn't tell them was the story behind her knowledge. The tale of how one rainy night, a famous musician had taught her that everyone carried a song inside themselves, waiting to be heard, and that sometimes all it took was one person believing in you to find the courage to sing it. The silver pen had become legendary among the small circle of musicians and songwriters who knew Maggie's story. Young artists would ask to hold it, as if its magic might somehow transfer to their own creative endeavors. Maggie would always let them, understanding that hope was something that needed to be shared rather than kept private. "The pen isn't magic," she would tell them. "What's magic is the willingness to believe that your story matters, that your voice deserves to be heard, that your dreams are worth pursuing even when everyone else thinks you should be more practical." But she would always add, with the kind of smile that came from hard-won wisdom, "Though I have to admit, it doesn't hurt to have really good tools for the job." The napkin with Danny Korchmar's phone number had long since been replaced by a formal business relationship and a friendship that had developed over years of working together on Maggie's albums. But she had kept the original napkin, now preserved between sheets of acid-free paper in a frame that hung in her home studio as a reminder of the moment when everything changed. Visitors to her studio would often ask about the frame napkin, and Maggie would tell them a version of the story that focused on the universal themes rather than the specific celebrity encounter. She had learned that the most important part of her story wasn't that Billy Joel had helped her, but that someone had chosen to see value in her dreams when she had forgotten they existed. "The lesson isn't that you need to meet someone famous," she would explain. "The lesson is that you never know when someone might come into your life who sees something in you that you can't see in yourself. And equally important, you never know when you might be that person for someone else." This philosophy had become central to how Maggie approached both her music and her interactions with other people. She began actively looking for opportunities to encourage other artists, other dreamers, other people whose talents were hidden beneath layers of circumstance and self-doubt. At the diner, she would listen carefully when customers mentioned creative pursuits they had abandoned or artistic dreams they thought were impractical. She would ask follow-up questions, offer genuine interest, and sometimes slip them business cards of local music venues or art galleries that welcomed new artists. Her own success, modest though it was by industry standards, had taught her that there were many different ways to make a meaningful life in the arts. Not everyone needed to sell millions of records or perform in sold-out stadiums. Some people just needed to know that their creativity mattered, that their voice had value, that their particular way of seeing the world deserved expression. During her performances, Maggie would often talk between songs about the importance of supporting local artists and independent musicians. She would encourage audience members to attend open mic nights, to buy CDs directly from artists, to share music they loved with their friends and family members. The music industry is really just a collection of individual people making choices about what they want to support, she would say. Every time you buy an album, every time you attend a concert, every time you tell someone about a song that moved you, you're casting a vote for the kind of world you want to live in. Her albums had never sold in huge quantities, but they had sold steadily over the years, building an audience of listeners who valued authenticity over flash, substance over style. These fans became evangelists for her music, sharing her songs with friends and family members who they thought would appreciate her particular brand of honest storytelling. The ripple effect of Billy's kindness had extended far beyond Maggie's individual success. Her music had inspired other people to pursue their own creative dreams. Her story had reminded countless individuals that it was never too late to start over, and her example had shown that success could be measured in terms of personal fulfillment and positive impact rather than just commercial achievement. In the decade following her debut album, Maggie received hundreds of letters and emails from people whose lives had been touched by her music. Some were from other late-blooming artists who had found the courage to pursue their own creative paths. Others were from people who had simply found comfort and inspiration in her songs during difficult periods of their lives. One letter that particularly moved her came from a woman in Phoenix who had been working as a school janitor while writing poetry in her spare time. She had heard Maggie's story on a public radio interview and decided to submit some of her poems to a local literary magazine. One of them was accepted for publication, leading to others, and eventually to a small collection that was published by a regional press. "Your music reminded me that art doesn't have to be glamorous to be meaningful," the woman wrote. "Sometimes, the most important stories come from people who are living regular lives, but paying attention to the extraordinary moments hidden inside the ordinary ones." Another letter came from a man in his 60s who had played guitar in his youth, but had put it away when he got married and started a family. After hearing Maggie perform at a small venue in upstate New York, he had gone home and taken his guitar out of the closet for the first time in 30 years. "I'm never going to be a professional musician," he wrote, "but that's not the point anymore. The point is that music makes me feel alive in a way that nothing else does. Your story reminded me that it's okay to do something just because it brings you joy, not because it's going to make you rich or famous." These letters reinforced Maggie's understanding that her true success lay not in chart positions or album sales, but in the connections her music created between her own experience and the experiences of people she would never meet, but whose lives had somehow intersected with hers through the medium of song. Billy Joel, who received similar letters from fans around the world, understood this phenomenon completely. He had learned over the decades that the songs that meant the most to people were often not the biggest hits, but the ones that spoke directly to their personal experiences and struggles. When he played Piano Man in concert, he would see audience members singing along with expressions that suggested the song meant something deeply personal to them. They weren't just enjoying a catchy melody. They were participating in a shared recognition of the loneliness and hope that characterized so much of American life. Similarly, when people heard Maggie's songs about working multiple jobs to make ends meet, about caring for aging parents, about dreams that survived despite being deferred, they recognized their own stories reflected in her lyrics. Music became a way of feeling less alone in struggles that often felt isolating and overwhelming. This was why Billy had been so moved by his encounter with Maggie that rainy night at the diner. He had recognized in her not just talent that deserved to be heard, but a perspective that needed to be shared. Her songs came from a part of American life that was often overlooked by mainstream media and popular culture. The experiences of working-class people who were doing their best to maintain dignity and hope in the face of economic uncertainty and social indifference. Her music provided a voice for people whose stories rarely made headlines, but whose daily struggles and small triumphs represented the true backbone of American society. In an era when popular culture often celebrated wealth and fame, Maggie's songs reminded listeners that there was honor and beauty in ordinary work, in taking care of family members, in treating strangers with kindness, even when you were tired and underpaid. The pen continued to move across paper, creating new songs that chronicled the evolving American experience from the perspective of someone who was living it, rather than observing it from a distance. Maggie's later albums addressed topics like healthcare costs, job insecurity, the challenges of aging parents, the environmental changes that were affecting rural communities, and the increasing difficulty of maintaining small-town businesses in the face of corporate competition. But her songs never became preachy or political in a partisan sense. Instead, they focused on the human impact of social and economic changes, on the individual stories behind statistical trends, on the ways that large-scale forces affected the daily lives of regular people. "I don't write protest songs," she would explain in interviews. "I write portrait songs. I try to paint pictures of real people dealing with real situations and let listeners draw their own conclusions about what needs to change." This approach resonated with audiences who were tired of being lectured to or manipulated by artists with obvious political agendas. Maggie's music offered something rarer and more valuable: the opportunity to see the world through someone else's eyes without feeling pressured to adopt a particular ideology or political position. Her concerts became gatherings of people who appreciated this kind of honest storytelling. The audiences were diverse in terms of age, occupation, and background, but united by their appreciation for music that treated them as intelligent adults capable of thinking for themselves. At these performances, Billy Joel's original act of kindness continued to ripple outward in ways that neither he nor Maggie could have anticipated. Audience members would leave her concerts inspired not just by her music, but by her story of late-blooming success and the reminder that dreams could be resurrected no matter how long they had been buried.